"You have 1 minute to clean this mess and bring me another glass of wine," my daughter-in-law yelled in front of our Thanksgiving guests after deliberately dropping her food on the floor. I simply said, "Thank you." A second later, the whole room panicked. The next day, I did something that sent her running to her lawyer. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." The wine glass shattered against the hardwood floor of my dining room, sending burgundy liquid splashing across the cream-colored carpet my late wife Margaret had chosen 27 years ago. The sound cut through the Thanksgiving chatter like a blade, and suddenly every conversation in the room died. "You have 1 minute to clean up this mess and serve me another glass of wine." Maya's voice pierced the silence, her perfectly manicured finger pointing down at the deliberate disaster she'd just created. My daughter-in-law stood there in her designer dress, hands on her hips, looking down at me like I was nothing more than hired help. I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me. My son David sat frozen at the head of the table, his face pale. My sister Ellen gasped audibly from her seat near the window. Maya's parents, visiting from California, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Even little Tommy, David's 8-year-old from his first marriage, stared with wide eyes from the kids' table. The familiar knot in my stomach tightened. This wasn't the first time Maya had humiliated me in front of others, but it was certainly the most public. For 3 years, since David married her, I'd endured her subtle cruelties, her passive-aggressive comments, her way of making me feel like a stranger in my own home. But this was different. This was her declaring war in front of everyone. I looked down at the mess on my floor, the wine soaking into the fibers of the carpet Margaret and I had saved months to afford. Something inside me shifted. Not anger exactly, something colder, something that had been building for a very long time. "Thank you," I said quietly, my voice steady and calm. The room went silent. Maya blinked, clearly expecting tears, apologies, or at least the scrambling compliance she'd grown accustomed to from me. Instead, I remained standing exactly where I was, my hands at my sides, looking directly at her. "What did you just say?" Maya's voice cracked slightly, confusion replacing her earlier confidence. "I said thank you." I repeated the words with the same even tone, never breaking eye contact. David finally found his voice. "Dad, what are you doing?" I turned to look at my son, this man I'd raised from a baby, who'd somehow become a stranger over these past 3 years. "I'm thanking your wife, David. She's just given me exactly what I needed." Maya's face had gone from flushed with anger to pale with something approaching panic. "Roger, I think you're having one of your episodes again. Maybe you should go lie down." Episodes. That was Maya's favorite explanation for any time I showed even a hint of backbone. According to her, I was becoming senile, forgetful, prone to confusion. She'd been planting these seeds with David for months, convincing him that his old father was losing his grip on reality. "I'm perfectly clear, Maya." I smiled then, and I saw her take an actual step backward, clearer than I've been in 3 years. Ellen stood up from her chair, her face etched with concern. "Roger, honey, maybe we should talk privately." "No need, Ellen. Everyone here should witness this." I looked around the room, taking in all the faces, family, friends, people who'd known me for decades, people who'd watched Maya systematically strip away my dignity piece by piece. You see, I've been playing a role for quite some time now. The confused old man, the grateful father-in-law, the widower who's just so thankful to have his son's new wife help him navigate his golden years. Maya's breathing had become shallow. "David, he's clearly not well. This is exactly what I've been telling you about." But David was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Recognition. As if he was seeing his father for the first time in a long while. "The truth is," I continued, my voice carrying easily through the silent room, "I've been documenting everything. Every cruel comment, every manipulation, every attempt to isolate me from my own family, every lie you've told about my mental state. That's enough." Maya's composure finally cracked completely. "David, do something. He's having a complete breakdown." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. With a few taps, I played back a recording from just 2 weeks ago. Maya's voice filled the room, crystal clear. "The old fool actually believes I care about him. Once I get him declared incompetent, we'll have complete control of everything. The house, the savings, all of it." The color drained from David's face. Maya grabbed for my phone, but I pulled it away easily. "There's more," I said softly. "Much more. 3 years' worth of recordings, actually. Amazing what people will say when they think no one is listening. Maya looked around the room wildly, seeing the disgust and shock on every face. Her parents had gone completely rigid. Her father, a retired banker, was staring at his daughter like he'd never seen her before. "This is fabricated." Maya's voice was reaching a pitch that made Tommy cover his ears. "He's sick. He's paranoid. David, you know how confused he gets." But David was shaking his head slowly. "The voice on that recording, it's definitely you, Maya. And some of the things you've said to me about Dad, about his condition, I never questioned them because I trusted you. I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. My son was finally seeing through the fog Maya had created around him. David, you can't possibly believe this nonsense," Maya said, but her voice had lost all its earlier authority. She sounded desperate now, cornered. "I believe the evidence," David said quietly, "and I believe my father." Maya's eyes darted around the room one more time, taking in the faces that had turned from neutral observers to silent judges. Without another word, she grabbed her purse from the counter and headed for the door. "This isn't over," she called back, her voice shaking with rage and something else. Fear. "You'll regret this, all of you." The front door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed, I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, counting the seconds of my newfound freedom. David approached me slowly, his eyes red with unshed tears. "Dad, I'm so sorry. How long has she been?" 3 years, I said simply, "since the day she moved into this house." As I looked around at my family and friends, at their faces filled with sympathy and understanding, I felt the weight of those 3 years beginning to lift from my shoulders. But I also knew this was just the beginning. Maya wasn't the type to simply disappear quietly into the night. She would fight back, and when she did, she'd discover that her elderly father-in-law had been preparing for this battle far longer than she could possibly imagine. The house felt different after Maya stormed out. Lighter somehow, as if her very presence had been suffocating the air itself. David helped me clean up the wine stain, while Ellen gathered the remaining family members for what she called an emergency discussion. But I wasn't ready to talk about everything yet. Some secrets needed to be revealed carefully, methodically. After everyone left that evening, David and I sat in my study. The same room where I'd spent countless hours over the past 3 years documenting my daughter-in-law's systematic destruction of our family. David looked exhausted, older than his 34 years, as if he'd aged a decade in a single afternoon. "Tell me everything, Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "From the beginning." I poured myself 2 fingers of the bourbon Margaret used to say was too expensive for everyday drinking. Tonight felt like an exception. "It started the week after your honeymoon," I began, settling into my leather chair. "Do you remember how concerned Maya was about my living alone? How she insisted I needed someone to look after me?" David nodded slowly. "She said you seemed confused sometimes, that you'd forget conversations we'd had." "Conversations that never happened," I clarified. "Maya would tell you I'd said things I never said, agreed to things I never agreed to. She was building a case, David, making everyone believe I was losing my mental faculties." The pain in my son's eyes was almost unbearable. But why would she do that? I walked to my desk and opened the bottom drawer, the one Maya had tried numerous times to access. Inside was a folder thick with documents, photographs, and printed emails. "Because your mother left me more than you know about," David's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? I thought Mom's life insurance went to pay off the mortgage." "It did. But there was something else, something I never told anyone about." I pulled out a letter dated 18 months before Margaret's death. "Your mother had been investing secretly for years, small amounts at first, then larger sums as her side business took off. Margaret had run a small catering company from our kitchen, nothing fancy, but she'd been incredibly successful. What David didn't know was that she'd been putting every penny of profit into carefully chosen stock investments. By the time of her death, that modest portfolio had grown to nearly $400,000. "400,000? David's voice cracked. "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was grieving, and because I wanted to make sure it was handled properly. Your mother left specific instructions about that money. Half was to be held in trust for Tommy's college education, and the other half was to be used for my care in my final years, with whatever remained going to you after my death." I watched the realization dawn on David's face. Maya knew about this money. She found the paperwork 6 months after she moved in. I caught her in this study one night, going through my files. When I confronted her, she claimed she was just trying to organize things for me, help me keep track of my finances because I was becoming forgetful. That night had been a turning point. I'd realized then that Maya wasn't the loving daughter-in-law she pretended to be. She was a predator who'd identified a vulnerable target and was positioning herself to strike. The financial advisor called a few weeks later. I continued. Someone had been calling his office, claiming to be my representative, asking detailed questions about the account. When I called him back, he was confused. He said a woman had been very insistent that I was developing dementia and that she needed to be granted power of attorney to protect my assets. David's face had gone completely white. Oh God, Dad. I encouraged her to help you with your finances. When she said you were struggling to keep track of bills, I thought you were helping your old father. I reached over and squeezed his shoulder. That's what she was counting on. Maya is very good at manipulation, David. She knows exactly how to present herself as the concerned, helpful daughter-in-law, while systematically isolating her target. I opened another section of the folder and showed David printed copies of text messages Maya had sent to various family members over the past 3 years. Messages expressing concern about my mental state, my episodes of confusion, my alleged inability to care for myself properly. She's been building a narrative, I explained, creating a paper trail that would support a competency hearing if it ever came to that. Look at this one. David read aloud from a text Maya had sent to Ellen just 6 months ago. I'm really worried about Roger. Yesterday, he insisted he'd never agreed to let me help with his medication management, but we discussed it just last week. His memory is getting worse. I think we need to consider more intensive assistance. But Dad, you've never taken regular medication. You're healthier than men half your age. Exactly, but Ellen didn't know that. Maya made sure to paint a picture of an aging man too proud to admit he needed help, and a loving daughter-in-law doing her best to care for him. I pulled out another document. She also convinced the neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, that I'd been wandering around the yard at night in my pajamas, looking confused. David shook his head in disbelief. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that to me once. She said Maya had told her to keep an eye on you. I confronted Mrs. Patterson about it 2 weeks ago. She was shocked when I told her I'd never wandered anywhere in my pajamas. Maya had fabricated the entire story. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of those 3 years of accumulated lies. The most insidious part was how she isolated me from the people who knew me best. Every time I contradicted one of her stories, she'd express concern about my episodes. Eventually, people stopped listening to my side. David was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd told him. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes full of pain and regret. How long have you known? About her real intentions, I mean. I suspected within the first year, but I didn't have proof until recently. I pulled out the final document in the folder. 3 weeks ago, I received this letter from a law firm in Phoenix. David read the letter, his face growing paler with each line. It was from an attorney specializing in elder financial abuse, responding to an inquiry about the legal requirements for having someone declared mentally incompetent in our state. She consulted with lawyers. David's voice was barely audible. The inquiry was made using my name and social security number. When the attorney's office called to follow up, they reached me directly. I explained that I had never contacted them, and they agreed to send me copies of all correspondence. David set the letter down with shaking hands. She was planning to have you declared incompetent, and once she had guardianship, she would have had complete control over Margaret's inheritance. $400,000, David, enough to change someone's life significantly. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, marking the end of what had been the most emotionally exhausting day in recent memory, but also the most liberating. Dad, what do we do now? How do we stop her? I smiled for the first time in hours. We don't have to stop her, son. She's going to stop herself. I closed the folder and locked it back in the drawer. You see, Maya made one critical mistake in all of her planning. David looked at me expectantly. She assumed I was exactly what she wanted me to be. A confused, isolated old man with no allies and no plan. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where Maya's car had been parked for 3 years. But tomorrow, she's going to discover just how wrong she was about me, As David and I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's death: anticipation for the future. Maya thought she'd been playing chess while I was playing checkers. Tomorrow, she'd learned that I'd been playing an entirely different game altogether. Maya's car pulled into the driveway at exactly 8:15 the next morning. I watched from my bedroom window as she sat behind the wheel for several minutes, probably rehearsing whatever speech she'd prepared for what she assumed would be damage control. She had no idea that her world was about to collapse entirely. I'd been awake since 5, not from anxiety but from excitement. After 3 years of playing the role of a confused, manipulated old man, today I would finally reveal the full scope of what I'd discovered about my daughter-in-law's criminal activities. David had stayed the night, sleeping in his old room for the first time since his marriage. Over breakfast, he'd asked me repeatedly what I meant about Maya discovering something today. I'd simply told him to trust me and to make sure he was available around 10 o'clock. The doorbell rang precisely at 8:30. Maya had always been punctual. I'd give her that. It was one of the few genuine qualities in an otherwise fabricated personality. "Roger," she called through the door, her voice artificially sweet. "I think we need to talk about yesterday. I'm worried about you." I opened the door to find Maya dressed in what I'd come to recognize as her concerned family member outfit. Conservative blouse, minimal makeup, worried expression. She was carrying a small gift bag, probably containing some token meant to reinforce her image as the caring daughter-in-law. "Of course, Maya, please come in." She seemed surprised by my calm demeanor. "I brought you some of those sugar-free cookies you like," she said, holding up the bag. "I know yesterday was stressful for everyone." Sugar-free cookies, another lie in a long catalog of deceptions. I'd never eaten a sugar-free cookie in my life, but Maya had been telling people for months that I was diabetic and required a special diet. Just another piece of evidence supporting her narrative about my declining health. "That's very thoughtful," I said, leading her into the living room. "Would you like some coffee?" "Actually, Roger, I think we should discuss what happened yesterday. You seemed very confused, and some of the things you said concerned me greatly." I settled into my favorite chair and gestured for her to sit on the couch. "I wasn't confused at all, Maya. In fact, I've never been clearer about anything in my life." Her smile faltered slightly. "Now, Roger, you know that's not true. You played some kind of recording that sounded like my voice, but we both know how easy it is to manipulate audio these days. Technology can be very confusing for someone your age." "My age." I repeated the phrase thoughtfully. "You know, Maya, you've been very focused on my age lately. My mental capacity, my ability to handle my own affairs. Because I care about you," she said, but her voice had taken on a sharper edge. "David and I both worry about you living alone in this big house. Yesterday's episode just confirms that you need more support." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. "Speaking of support, Maya, I received something very interesting in yesterday's mail. It arrived just before our Thanksgiving dinner." The color began to drain from her face as I opened the envelope. "What is that?" "Legal documents," I said simply. "From several different sources, actually. Would you like me to read them aloud?" Maya's breathing had become noticeably shallow. "Roger, I don't think this is the time for—" "Oh, I think this is exactly the time." I pulled out the first document. "This is a copy of a power of attorney form filed with the county clerk's office 3 weeks ago. According to this document, I granted you complete authority over my finances due to my declining mental capacity." Maya opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "The interesting thing is," I continued, "I never signed this document. In fact, I never even saw it until yesterday. But it bears what appears to be my signature." "That's impossible," Maya stammered. "I mean, if you signed it, you must have forgotten. That's exactly the kind of thing I've been worried about." I set the document aside and picked up another one. "This is even more fascinating. It's a letter to my financial advisor, allegedly written by me, authorizing you to make decisions about my investment accounts. Again, I have no memory of writing this letter, but it certainly looks like my handwriting." Maya had gone completely white now. She gripped the arm of the couch so tightly her knuckles were bloodless. "The most interesting document, however, is this one." I held up a third paper. "It's a medical evaluation, supposedly conducted by Dr. Harrison, stating that I showed clear signs of dementia and recommending that I be placed under the care of a responsible family member." "Dr. Harrison is a very respected physician," Maya said weakly. "I'm sure he is. Unfortunately, Dr. Harrison retired 2 years ago and moved to Florida. According to his former office staff, he never conducted any evaluation of me. They have no record of me ever being a patient." Maya stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous, Roger. You're clearly having another episode. I think I should call David. David is already on his way, I said calmly, along with several other people who are very interested in these documents. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Maya spun toward the sound like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. That would be Detective Morrison from the Financial Crimes Unit, I explained, making no move to answer the door, along with my attorney, James Crawford, and a representative from the district attorney's office. Maya's legs seemed to give out, and she collapsed back onto the couch. What are you saying? I'm saying that forging someone's signature on legal documents is a felony, Maya, as is filing false medical reports and attempting to fraudulently gain control of someone's assets. I stood up and walked to the front door. I'm also saying that the confused old man you thought you were manipulating has been working with law enforcement for the past 6 months. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. You see, Maya, when I first discovered what you were doing, I didn't just start recording our conversations. I contacted the police. Detective Morrison has been building a case against you for financial elder abuse. Every forged document, every false medical claim, every lie you told has been carefully documented. Maya was hyperventilating now. You can't prove anything. Those recordings could be fake. You're old and confused and I'm also a retired accountant who spent 37 years investigating financial fraud for the state auditor's office. I opened the front door to admit Detective Morrison, a tall woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Behind her stood James Crawford, my attorney, and David, whose face showed a mixture of shock and growing understanding. Good morning, Mr. Thornton, Detective Morrison said. Is Mrs. Thornton ready to answer some questions? Maya looked around the room wildly, taking in the faces of people who now saw her for exactly what she was.
This is insane. Roger is sick. He's paranoid and delusional. David, tell them. But David was staring at the documents spread across my coffee table, his face pale with realization. Maya, did you really forge Dad's signature on these papers? I was trying to protect him, she screamed. He's not capable of making decisions anymore.
Someone had to take control before he lost everything. Detective Morrison stepped forward. Mrs. Thornton, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the detective began reading Maya her rights, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Not revenge exactly, but justice. For 3 years, this woman had systematically tried to steal my independence, my dignity, and my late wife's legacy. She'd turned my own son against me and convinced half the neighborhood that I was losing my mind. But Maya had made one crucial error in her calculations. She'd assumed that because I was older, I was also helpless. She'd never bothered to research my background or consider that someone who'd spent nearly 4 decades investigating financial crimes might recognize the signs when he became a victim himself. As Detective Morrison led Maya toward the door in handcuffs, she turned back to me with pure hatred in her eyes. You think you've won, old man? I'll fight this. I'll prove you're incompetent. Maya, I interrupted gently. You're going to need a very good lawyer. I suspect you'll be facing charges of forgery, fraud, attempted theft, and elder abuse. In this state, those charges carry a potential sentence of 15 to 20 years. The front door closed behind them with a finality that felt like the end of a very long, very dark chapter. David stood in the middle of my living room, looking lost and broken. Dad, I'm so sorry. How could I have been so blind? I put my arm around my son's shoulders. Because you loved her, David, and because she's very good at what she does. I guided him to the couch. But it's over now. She can't hurt either of us anymore. As we sat together in the quiet house, I realized that for the first time in 3 years, I felt completely safe in my own home. Maya's reign of terror was over, but I suspected her legal troubles were just beginning. 3 days after Maya's arrest, David and I were sitting in my kitchen sharing our first peaceful breakfast in years when the phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of a law firm I didn't recognize, Blackstone, Martinez and Associates. Mr. Thornton? The voice was crisp, professional. This is Angela Martinez. I'm representing Maya Thornton in her current legal matter. She's asked me to contact you regarding a possible resolution to this misunderstanding. I put the call on speaker so David could hear. There's no misunderstanding, Ms. Martinez. Your client committed multiple felonies. My client maintains that she was acting in your best interests, Mr. Thornton. She was concerned about your mental capacity and was simply trying to protect your assets from potential exploitation. David's face darkened. Even after everything we'd discovered, hearing Maya's lies repeated by her attorney made his jaw clench with anger. Ms. Martinez, I said calmly, your client forged my signature on legal documents, filed false medical reports, and attempted to fraudulently gain control of nearly $400,000. These aren't the actions of someone concerned about my welfare. There was a pause. $400,000? Mr. Thornton, I think there may be some confusion about the amounts involved here. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean? According to my client, the estate she was trying to protect totaled approximately $1.7 million. David and I exchanged glances. $1.7 million. That was more than 4 times what I thought Margaret had left. Ms. Martinez, I think your client may have provided you with incorrect information. Perhaps we should meet in person, Mr. Thornton. There seem to be some discrepancies that need to be clarified. After I hung up, David and I sat in stunned silence. Finally, he spoke. Dad, is it possible Mom left more money than you knew about? I shook my head. I have all of her financial records, every bank statement, every investment account. There's no way she could have hidden that much money from me. But even as I said it, doubt crept into my mind. Margaret had been secretive about her catering business finances, handling all the bookkeeping herself. She'd always been better with numbers than I'd given her credit for. Was it possible she'd been more successful than even I knew? That afternoon, I called my financial advisor, Robert Chen, who'd been managing Margaret's investment portfolio since her death. Roger, I was wondering when you'd call, Robert said, after I explained why I was contacting him. I've been expecting to hear from you ever since that woman started calling my office. Maya called you. Multiple times over the past 2 years. She claimed to be your daughter-in-law and said you were developing dementia. She wanted access to all your account information. I felt my stomach drop. What did you tell her? Nothing, of course, but Roger, there's something you need to know. Your wife's investment portfolio, it's worth significantly more than the $400,000 we discussed when she passed away. How much more? Robert was quiet for a moment. As of yesterday's closing, approximately $1.6 million. The room seemed to spin around me. That's impossible. Margaret never mentioned anything about that kind of money. She was very specific about keeping the full amount confidential until you were ready to deal with it. She said you were grieving and that the shock of the total might be overwhelming. She asked me to only discuss the initial $400,000 until you specifically inquired about the rest. I sank into my chair. Margaret had been protecting me even after her death, knowing that learning about such a substantial inheritance while I was mourning might be too much to handle. But somehow, Maya had discovered the truth. Robert, how could Maya have found out about the full amount? That's what worries me, Roger. The only way she could have known was if she'd somehow accessed Margaret's personal records, documents that should have been in your possession. I thought back to those early days after Maya moved in, when she'd claimed to be helping me organize Margaret's papers. She'd spent hours going through boxes in the basement, supposedly sorting personal items from financial documents. At the time, I'd been grateful for her help. Now I realized she'd been conducting a treasure hunt. There's something else, Robert continued. 3 months ago, someone called claiming to be you, asking about procedures for transferring the full portfolio to a family trust. When I called your home number to confirm, a woman answered and said you were sleeping, but that she could take a message. She never gave you that message, did she? No, I said quietly. She didn't. After ending the call with Robert, I immediately contacted Detective Morrison. She arrived at my house within an hour, bringing with her a forensic accountant from the district attorney's office. Mr. Thornton, Detective Morrison said as we settled in my living room, this information changes the scope of our investigation significantly. We're no longer looking at attempted theft of $400,000. We're looking at a conspiracy to steal over $1.5 million. David, who'd been listening quietly, finally spoke up. Detective, there's something else Maya did that I didn't think was important before. But now, what is it, son? About a year ago, Maya convinced me to give her copies of all Dad's important documents. She said she needed them to help coordinate his care with his doctors, insurance cards, social security information, even his birth certificate. The forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Patricia Wells, leaned forward. Did she ask for anything else? Bank account numbers? Investment information? David's face went pale. She said Dad had given her some financial documents, but that they were incomplete. She asked if I had copies of anything from Mom's estate settlement. And did you? I had copies of the basic probate documents. Maya said she needed them to make sure Dad's medical insurance was properly coordinated with his inheritance status. Detective Morrison and Dr. Wells exchanged meaningful looks. Mr. Thornton, the detective said, I think your daughter-in-law had been planning this theft for much longer than we initially suspected. Dr. Wells opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. We've been analyzing the financial documents recovered from Mrs. Thornton's personal computer. She had created detailed spreadsheets tracking your entire financial portfolio, including assets you may not even be aware of. She spread several papers across my coffee table. They showed Maya's calculations of my total net worth, including the house, Margaret's investments, my pension, and even my Social Security benefits projected over my expected lifespan. According to her projections, Dr. Wells continued, she believed that by gaining control of your finances, she could access approximately $2.2 million over the next 10 to 15 years. I stared at the spreadsheets, amazed by their thoroughness. Maya had researched every aspect of my financial life with the precision of a professional investigator. She'd even calculated the potential value of my house if it were sold and the proceeds invested. There's more, Detective Morrison said. We found evidence that she'd been researching assisted living facilities, expensive ones. She'd apparently planned to have you declared incompetent and then place you in institutional care while she managed your assets. David's hands were shaking. She was going to put Dad in a nursing home? Not just any nursing home, Dr. Wells said. She'd identified a facility that costs approximately $8,000 per month. Based on her calculations, she believed your father's assets could support that expense for 12 to 15 years, after which she assumed he would qualify for Medicaid. The callousness of it took my breath away. Maya hadn't just planned to steal my money, she'd planned to warehouse me in an institution while she spent my late wife's legacy on herself. Gentlemen, Detective Morrison said, standing up, I think we have enough evidence to file additional charges. Mrs. Thornton is going to be facing a much more serious legal situation than she anticipated. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Wells turned back to me. Mr. Thornton, you should know that your wife was remarkably astute with her investments. The portfolio she built represents years of careful planning and shrewd decisions. She clearly intended for you to be financially secure for the rest of your life. After they left, David and I sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he looked at me with tears in his eyes. Dad, I helped her. I gave her the information she needed to steal from you. I reached over and squeezed his hand. You were trying to help your father, David. She manipulated you just like she manipulated everyone else. But I should have known. I should have seen what she was doing. Maya spent 3 years perfecting her deception. She studied our family, learned our weaknesses, and exploited our love for each other. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where Maya's car used to sit. But she made one critical error. What's that? I turned back to my son with a smile. She underestimated how much your mother taught me about recognizing a con artist. Margaret always said that the most dangerous thieves are the ones who convince you they're trying to help you. The next morning, I called Maya's attorney to decline any settlement discussions. Maya had crossed a line from which there could be no return. She'd planned to steal my wife's legacy and abandon me in an institution, all while convincing my own son that she was acting in my best interests. Now it was time for her to face the full consequences of her choices. And based on what Detective Morrison had told me about the additional charges being filed, those consequences were going to be far more severe than Maya had ever imagined. 2 weeks after Maya's arrest, I received an unexpected call from the county jail. Maya was requesting a visit. Against David's strong objections and Detective Morrison's advice, I agreed to see her. I needed to look into the eyes of the woman who'd spent 3 years trying to destroy my life, and understand what drove someone to such calculated cruelty. The visiting room at the county jail was a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and plastic chairs bolted to the floor. Maya appeared wearing an orange jumpsuit, her perfectly styled hair now hanging limply around her shoulders. The confident, manipulative woman who'd terrorized my household had been replaced by someone who looked desperate and cornered. Roger, she said as she sat down across from me, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for coming. I studied her face, looking for any trace of genuine remorse. What I saw instead was calculation. Even now, even here, she was working an angle. I wanted to see you face to face, Maya, to understand why you did what you did. She leaned forward, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the woman who'd charmed my son into marriage. Roger, I know how this looks, but you have to understand I was trying to protect you. The world is full of people who prey on elderly individuals with assets. I was trying to make sure no one could take advantage of you. The audacity of it was breathtaking. Even sitting in jail, facing multiple felony charges, she was still trying to manipulate me. By forging my signature, by filing false medical reports, by planning to put me in a nursing home while you spent my wife's money. Her composure cracked slightly. You weren't supposed to find out about the nursing home. That was just a backup plan, in case your health really did decline. My health was never declining, Maya. You made that up. But it could have, she said, her voice becoming more urgent. You're 62 years old, Roger. What happens when you're 70, 80? Who's going to take care of you then? David has his own life, his own problems. I was thinking ahead, planning for contingencies. I felt a cold anger settle in my chest. With money that didn't belong to you. Money that would have eventually gone to David anyway. I was just ensuring it was managed properly until then. The visiting room was monitored, and I was aware that our conversation was being recorded. But I'd come here for a specific purpose, and Maya was giving me exactly what I needed. Tell me about the spreadsheets, Maya. The ones where you calculated my net worth down to the penny. She blinked, clearly not expecting me to know about those. I was just trying to understand your financial situation so I could help manage things better. You calculated how long I would live. You researched nursing homes. You even projected how much money would be left after my death. I leaned back in my chair. That doesn't sound like someone concerned about my welfare. That sounds like someone planning a heist. Maya's mask finally slipped completely. You have no idea what it's like, she hissed, her voice rising. David and I struggle every month to pay our bills while you sit in that big house on top of a fortune you don't even need. You're alone, Roger. You have no friends, no social life, no purpose. That money could have given David and me a real future. So you decided to steal it. I decided to redirect it to people who could actually use it. Her eyes were blazing now, all pretense of concern abandoned. You're going to die in a few years anyway. What's the point of leaving all that money sitting in accounts when it could be improving lives right now? There it was, the truth I'd suspected but never quite believed until this moment. Maya hadn't just planned to steal my money. She'd been waiting for me to die so she could inherit it through David. When that wasn't happening fast enough, she'd decided to accelerate the process by having me declared incompetent. And if I refused to cooperate, if I fought your attempts to control my finances. Maya's smile was cold and calculating. Accidents happen, Roger, especially to elderly people living alone in big houses. Falls downstairs, medication mix-ups, kitchen fires from forgotten stove burners. Who would question it? Everyone already believed you were becoming forgetful and confused. The blood in my veins turned to ice. She was talking about murder. Not directly, but the implication was clear enough that I wondered if the recording equipment was picking up the subtle threat in her words. You would have killed me. I would have allowed nature to take its course, she said with a shrug. Maybe helped it along a little if necessary. But it wouldn't have come to that. You would have signed the papers eventually. Everyone does when they realize they have no choice. I stared at this woman who'd shared Christmas dinners with my family, who'd pretended to care about my well-being, who'd convinced my son that she loved him. She was a predator in the truest sense of the word. Someone who identified vulnerable targets and consumed them systematically. Maya, do you understand that threatening to harm me constitutes another felony, especially when it's being recorded? The color drained from her face as she realized what she'd just said. She looked around the visiting room wildly, as if suddenly remembering where she was. I didn't threaten you. I was just explaining that accidents happen to old people. You said you might help nature along. That sounds like a threat to me. Maya stood up abruptly, the plastic chair scraping against the floor. This conversation is over. You tricked me into coming here. I didn't trick you into anything, Maya. I simply gave you an opportunity to tell the truth for once in your life. As the guard approached to escort her back to her cell, Maya turned to me with pure hatred in her eyes. You think you've won, old man? My lawyer says I'll be out on bail within a week. And when I am, I'm going to make your life hell. I'm going to contest every charge, drag this through the courts for years. I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of vindictive, paranoid old fool you really are. I smiled calmly. Maya, you just threatened me again, in front of a guard, while being recorded. I don't think your lawyer is going to be very happy about that. The guard took her arm, and as they led her away, I heard her screaming profanities that echoed through the corridor. I sat alone in the visiting room for several minutes after she was gone, processing what I'd just heard. Maya hadn't just planned to steal from me. She'd been prepared to kill me, if necessary. The woman my son had married, the woman who'd lived in my house and eaten at my table, had been planning my murder. When I finally left the jail, I drove directly to Detective Morrison's office. She listened to my account of the visit with growing amazement. Mr. Thornton, you realize that what she said to you constitutes terroristic threatening and conspiracy to commit murder. I was hoping you'd say that. Detective Morrison leaned back in her chair. Between the original fraud charges and these new threats, Maya Thornton is looking at potentially 25 to 30 years in prison. She won't be eligible for bail now. That evening, I sat David down and told him everything Maya had said during our visit. I watched my son's face go through a range of emotions: shock, disgust, horror, and finally, a kind of grim relief. Dad, she really would have killed you. I think she would have tried. But Maya made the same mistake she'd been making all along. She underestimated me. David was quiet for a long time. Finally, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. How do I live with the fact that I brought a murderer into our family? How do I explain to Tommy that his stepmother is a criminal? I put my hand on his shoulder. You tell him that sometimes people aren't who they pretend to be. You tell him that you made a mistake, but that you learned from it. And you make sure he knows that family means protecting each other, not exploiting each other. That night, I called my attorney to discuss filing for divorce on David's behalf. Maya had shown her true nature, and there was no coming back from threats of murder. My son's marriage was over, but for the first time in 3 years, I felt like we might actually have a future worth looking forward to. The next morning brought news that Maya's bail had been revoked due to the new charges. She would remain in custody until her trial, which could be months away. For the first time since this nightmare began, I knew that my family was truly safe from her influence. As I sat in my kitchen drinking my morning coffee, I realized that Margaret would have been proud of how I'd handled this situation. She'd always said I was too trusting for my own good, but she'd also taught me that sometimes the best way to catch a predator is to give them enough rope to hang themselves. Maya had finally provided all the rope she needed. 6 months later, I stood in the same courtroom where Maya's fate would be decided. She sat at the defendant's table in a gray suit, flanked by 2 public defenders who'd taken her case after she'd exhausted her resources hiring private attorneys. The confident, manipulative woman who'd terrorized my household was gone, replaced by someone who looked hollow and defeated. The trial had lasted 3 weeks. Prosecutor after prosecutor had presented evidence of Maya's elaborate scheme: the forged documents, the false medical reports, the recorded conversations where she'd admitted her plans. Her own computer files had provided the most damaging testimony, revealing years of calculated planning and the cold-blooded precision with which she'd mapped out my financial destruction. But it was the recording of our jailhouse conversation that had sealed her fate. When the jury heard Maya's own voice describing how she might help nature along in ending my life, several of them had visibly recoiled. Her defense attorney's attempts to characterize her words as metaphorical or taken out of context had fallen flat. Now, as Judge Patricia Hendricks prepared to announce the verdict, I felt a strange sense of closure, not satisfaction exactly, but the knowledge that justice was finally being served. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Hendricks said. Maya stood on unsteady legs, her hands clasped in front of her. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the spreadsheets, the nursing home research, the threats. My sympathy evaporated. On the charge of attempted theft by deception, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of forgery in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of filing false medical reports, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of terroristic threatening, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. Maya's legs gave out, and she collapsed into her chair. One of her attorneys put a steadying hand on her shoulder, but she shook him off violently. Judge Hendricks continued reading the verdicts for each of the 12 charges Maya faced, guilty on every count. When the judge finished, the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Maya's quiet sobbing. Sentencing will be scheduled for 2 weeks from today, Judge Hendricks announced. Given the severity and premeditated nature of these crimes, the defendant will remain in custody without bail. As the bailiff led Maya away in handcuffs, she turned to look at me one last time. The hatred in her eyes was still there, but it was overwhelmed by something else, the knowledge that she'd lost completely and irrevocably. Outside the courthouse, David and I stood in the late afternoon sunshine. My son had attended every day of the trial, watching as the full scope of his ex-wife's betrayal was laid bare for the world to see. The divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, with Maya having no choice but to accept David's terms given her legal situation. "How do you feel, Dad?" David asked as we walked toward my car. I thought about the question seriously. For 3 years, Maya had controlled every aspect of my life through fear, manipulation, and lies. She'd stolen my independence, poisoned my relationship with my son, and planned to murder me for money. Now she was going to prison for what would likely be the rest of her productive life. "Free," I said finally. For the first time in 3 years, I feel completely free. 2 weeks later, we returned to the courthouse for sentencing. Judge Hendricks had reviewed all the evidence, the pre-sentencing reports, and the victim impact statements that David and I had submitted. Maya stood before the bench looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "Mrs. Thornton," Judge Hendricks began, "in my 23 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case that demonstrates such calculated cruelty and premeditated evil. You didn't just attempt to steal money from an elderly man. You systematically destroyed his relationship with his family, isolated him from his support network, and planned to institutionalize him against his will while you spent his deceased wife's legacy on yourself." Maya stared at the floor, offering no response. "Most disturbing of all, when your scheme was discovered, you threatened to murder the very man you claimed to be protecting. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was a carefully planned campaign of elder abuse that could have ended in homicide." The judge paused, consulting her notes. "On the charge of attempted theft by deception, I sentence you to 8 years in state prison. On the charge of forgery in the first degree, I sentence you to 5 years in state prison. On the charge of filing false medical reports, I sentence you to 3 years in state prison. On the charge of terroristic threatening, I sentence you to 7 years in state prison. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, I sentence you to 15 years in state prison." Maya's attorney leaned over to whisper something to her, but she didn't respond. "These sentences will run consecutively, not concurrently, for a total of 38 years in state prison. You will be eligible for parole after serving 25 years. Maya was 61 years old. Even with parole, she would be in her 80s before she saw freedom again. Effectively, it was a life sentence. As the bailiff approached to lead her away, Maya finally looked up at the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to make a statement." Judge Hendricks nodded. "You may proceed." Maya turned to face me directly. For a moment, I thought she might finally offer an apology, some acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused. Instead, she said, "Roger Thornton is a bitter, vindictive old man who couldn't stand the thought of a younger woman having any influence in his family. He manufactured this entire case because he resented my relationship with his son." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Hendricks banged her gavel for order. "Mrs. Thornton, you have been convicted on the basis of overwhelming evidence, including your own recorded admissions. Your attempt to blame the victim demonstrates that you have learned nothing from this experience and feel no genuine remorse for your actions." Maya's face twisted with anger. "I regret nothing. Roger Thornton deserved everything that happened to him. That will be quite enough," Judge Hendricks said sharply. "Remove the defendant from my courtroom." As Maya was led away, still shouting accusations, I felt the final weight lift from my shoulders. She was gone, really truly gone, and she'd never be able to hurt me or my family again. 1 year later, David and I were sitting on the back porch of my house, watching 8-year-old Tommy play in the yard with the golden retriever puppy we'd gotten him for his birthday. My grandson had struggled with his stepmother's arrest and imprisonment, but with patience and counseling, he'd begun to understand that Maya's actions weren't his fault or anyone else's in the family. David had sold the house he'd shared with Maya and moved back in with me, at least temporarily. We'd spent the year rebuilding our relationship, learning to trust each other again after Maya's manipulations had driven us apart. It hadn't been easy, but we were finally beginning to feel like father and son again, rather than strangers sharing DNA.
Dad, David said, setting down his coffee cup, I've been thinking about what you said during the trial, about how Mom would have been proud of how you handled everything. I nodded. Margaret had been the stronger one in our marriage, the one who could spot a fraud or a manipulator from across a room. I'd always been too trusting, too willing to see the best in people. But when it mattered most, I'd finally learned to use the skills she'd tried to teach me. You know what I think she'd be most proud of? David continued. What's that? That you protected her legacy, not just the money but the values she tried to instill in our family. Love, loyalty, honesty. Maya tried to corrupt all of that, but you didn't let her. I watched Tommy chase his puppy around the oak tree Margaret and I had planted when David was born. In a few years, when Tommy was older, I'd tell him the full story of what had happened with Maya. I'd make sure he understood that family meant protecting each other, not exploiting each other. That love was about sacrifice and commitment, not manipulation and control. The money Margaret had left was still safely invested, growing steadily under Robert Chen's careful management. I'd updated my will to ensure that everything would go to David and Tommy when I was gone, with provisions to protect it from anyone who might try to manipulate them the way Maya had manipulated us. But more importantly, I'd reclaimed my life. My house felt like home again. My relationship with my son was stronger than it had been in years. My grandson knew he was loved and protected. Maya had tried to destroy all of that for money, but she'd failed completely. As the sun set behind the trees in my backyard, I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast to Margaret. She taught me that the most important inheritance we leave our children isn't money. It's the knowledge that they're loved unconditionally and the strength to recognize those who would harm them. Maya Thornton had learned too late that some families can't be broken, no matter how hard you try, and some old men are much stronger than they appear. I was 63 years old, completely free, and surrounded by people who truly loved me. Maya was spending her days in a concrete cell, counting the decades until she might see freedom again. Justice, I realized, sometimes comes with its own form of perfect peace.